Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Wendy Finkelman. I'm the director of our education programs at VCA, and I am filling in for Tami Brockway Joyce, who woke up this morning feeling under the weather. So I'm so pleased to be here on stage with Hitoshi Pruiksma. And Tom is going to be talking about his book for a bit, and then I'm going to ask some questions, and then we'll open it up to questions that you all may have. Before we get started, if I can remind you to silence your cell phone, and then also just encourage you to check out our website, because we have a month that's chock full of talks and performances that you might be interested in as well. So Hitoshi Pruiksma is an author, a translator, a teacher, and a performer. He's written and collaborated on 3 books, aside from the book that he's going to be talking about tonight. Tom teaches for an online grammar series called Cozy Grammar, which, if you're unfamiliar, you should Google it and check it out. It's awesome. It is the best thing you've ever heard of. It's the way grammar should be taught. It's the way I wish I had learned grammar. And he speaks and performs widely and has performed numerous shows on this stage. Tom has received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, For Culture, Artists Trust, and the Fulbright Program. And on a personal note, Tom is my neighbor and my friend, and truly one of the most creative people that I've ever met. Today, Tom is going to be talking about his newest book, The Kural, a new translation of the classic Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Wendy.
Yeah.
And thanks to all of you for coming out, and all of you who are watching from the various places you may be watching. I wanted to tell you a story. It's 1998. I'm fresh out of college. I'm in the city of Madurai, which is the cultural capital of the state of Tamil Nadu in the south of India. I'm an English teacher, and I'm going to my student's house for dinner. Meenakshi Sundaram had been inviting me to his house from the very first day I entered the classroom. And I was shy and still learning how to speak Tamil, but he finally convinced me that the day had come, and so I went with him to his house. It was a small house near the one of the side streets beside the Meenakshi Temple, which is a glorious temple complex in the city, in the very center, in fact, of the city of Madurai. And I went inside, and not only did I meet his parents and his brothers and his sisters, but I met, I think, almost everybody on the street, because they had all come to see this American teacher who somehow could speak a little bit of Tamil. We had an enormous feast, far more food than I could possibly have eaten. And at the end of the evening, when I said, I probably should get going, they said, oh, just stay the night, you can have breakfast, and we'll take you back in the morning. I was still too new to Tamil Nadu, to Tamil hospitality, to realize that this was very ordinary, and they would have been happy. They would have put out a little bed for me, and I would have slept there, and I would have gotten up, and I would have had, I'm sure, a huge breakfast. But I said, oh, no, I have some work to do. I need to get back to the college. And before I left, the father approached me, and he gave me 2 gifts. One was a book by a 20th century Tamil poet, and the other was a book called the Tirukkural, or in short, the Kural. And he handed me this book and he said, when you learn Tamil well, and you must learn it well, you must read this book, because this book has everything you need to know in it. Here, take it. And I took it into the night, astonished at this family, which was not overflowing with books on its shelves, had given me 2 of their books. And I took it back and I thought, maybe one day, 50 years from now, I'll finally be able to read this book. I had heard of it. In fact, I had seen it. I had seen verses from it at the front of the city buses. You can see they're very short verses. They're, in fact, not even 2 lines long. They're about 1 5/8, if you want to be precise about it. But I had come to Tamil Nadu not to learn to read and write. I really just wanted to learn how to speak. I wanted to be able to speak with people, and I wanted to go and live in a village because I wanted to taste something of what a rooted, rural, enduring community might have to show me about some of the great questions we face today about how we relate to the earth beneath our feet and in our bones. You'll have to excuse me, I've been giving a lot of interviews, so I am losing my voice. Or hopefully I'm not losing my voice, but I'm a little talked. And for me to live in a village, which had been my aim in going to South India, I realized I really needed to be able to speak the language as well as possible. And luckily, I found an extraordinary teacher in a man named Dr. K.V. Ramakodi. And in fact, I have a picture of him too. This is when my parents came to visit me about a year into my stay. Dr. Ramakodi is, of course, in the center in the back row, and on his left, your right, is Mrs. K.R. Padmavati, his wife, my amma, which is Tamil for mother, and then on his right is one of his daughters, Manu. And Dr. Ramakodi was an extraordinarily patient and meticulous and demanding teacher. So after a year of studying with him, I was able to speak well enough that I could dare to go and live in a village. And I moved into a village outside of the city in what was one of the most difficult experiences in my life to that point. Because once I got there, I realized I was really in it. And I realized that their Tamar was quite different from the Tamar in the city. And that I had to tune my ear, I had to train my tongue, I had to learn how to do some of the simplest of things. One day, for instance, I was thinking, I have a couple things to put in I would put in a trash can, a couple pieces of paper. And I realized that there were no trash cans because nobody had any waste. And I thought, well, now what am I going to do? I guess I just stuck it in my pocket and I'll take it back to the college and I'll put it in their trash can. But the simplest things, going to the bathroom, washing the dishes after cooking my little meal for myself. And just learning how to move with people. But bit by bit, over that, what turned out to be a year and a half at that time, I was not only taken in as a member of my landlord's family, but as a member of the entire village. And I have a picture of my landlord's family. There I am with 3 of the 4 sons, 3 of the 4 brothers, my village amma, my village appa, and then the 4th son, who was taking this picture, is now in where I was standing. So there are the 4 sons, Karupaya, Sanjeevi, Viranan, and Adekalam. And the youngest, Viranan, who's standing between Amma and Appa, he will return in this story. So in the middle of this experience of learning to live in this village, my teacher surprised me by one day announcing, Tom, it's time for you to learn to read and write. Now, Tamil is a language which has very distinct written and spoken forms. You can learn to speak and have great difficulty reading and writing. You can learn to read and write and have great difficulty speaking. And I said to my teacher, whom I called Ayya, which is a word for respectful elder or teacher, I said, Ayya, I think that's a great idea, and I also think I have my hands and my tongue full already just speaking this language. I've just started to feel comfortable. And he looked at me and he said, so does that mean when you go back to your country, you're not going to write us letters? And I said, well, no, Ayya, of course, I'll be writing you and Amma letters all the time. And he said, well, you will want to be able to read the replies that we will send you, won't you? And I said, of course, Ayya, yes. Okay, we begin tomorrow. And we began. And not only did we begin learning to read and write, he began teaching me to read and write, he also had me start learning poetry. Now, I had a kind of checkered history with poetry, because although I knew it was something important, and though I had philosophical inclinations and questions, I just didn't really get poetry from about maybe the middle of middle school through college. I didn't have the patience for it. I was too insistent on learning the meaning of things. I wanted things to be cut and dried and clear, so I knew what I needed to think and what I needed to do. I studied ethics in college. I was interested in what was right and wrong. And to me, what I saw as the kind of secondary metaphors and niceties of poetry didn't speak to me. And so my teacher said, we're learning poetry, and I thought, oh dear, there's that thing I don't quite get. But I, by this point, trusted my teacher. And I said, okay, let's do this. And he began me with a 12th century Tamil woman poet and saint named Avvaiyar. And he had me memorize some 25 of her short 4-line poems. And something very interesting happened. These are poems which are very accessible, but they were old enough for me that I couldn't understand them directly for a couple weeks. And so when I memorized these poems, all I could do was listen to them. Listen to the sounds that were issuing from my own mouth. Listen to the rhythms I could feel in my body, breathing in and breathing out these poems. And I started to realize that the poems sound good. They have a music to them. They have a rhythm. They have something enticing and delightful and nourishing about them. So that when I did come to understand their meanings, those meanings were infinitely more meaningful because I had first heard their music. I'd first heard and enjoyed their music. And this turned out for me to be the great doorway, the great opening, the great key. Because when I came back 2.5 years later to the Pacific Northwest, I could hear English in a way I'd never heard it before. And I could hear poetry in English in a way I'd never heard it before. And that began what became a 20-year apprenticeship to language and to the inner lives of Tamil, English, and also Spanish, and a smattering of ancient Greek. It led in 2009 to a translation of those 25, well, more than 25 poems, include a translation of about 60 of the poems from this particular woman saint of the 12th century, including the 25 that I had originally memorized. And it also led to the book I'm excited to speak with you about tonight. So how did this book come into being, or this translation? In 2003 and 2004, I returned to South India on a Fulbright grant. I was interested in studying the relationship between people and land. During the week, I lived as a guest in my Tamil teacher's house, and on the weekends, I went back to the village to continue exploring the spoken language, the spoken world of my friends and now neighbors and family there. And over the course of that year, we studied the book that Meenakshi Sundaram's father had given me 6 years before, the Tirukkural. And we read a very special edition, which included all of the ancient or medieval commentaries from the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. And I even have a picture of those books in what is called the puja room in my teacher's house, the room where there are images of the gods, where on the morning prayers are said before these images. And this was a very important Tamil festival called Pongal, which is a harvest festival. And so we decided to bless the books. So in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a yellow cover and a blue cover. Those are 2 of the 3 books that make up the Tirukkural, or the Kural. We blessed those books. We read those books. I learned to read all of the commentaries to those poems. I memorized some 600 or 700 of the verses. There are about 1,330 verses in the book. I would go up to the flat roof on the top of my teacher's house, where there's a kind of open patio with parapet walls, and I had my little note cards, and every day I'd work away at my memorizing project. Traditionally, a student wishing to study this work with a teacher would go to a teacher and say, yeah, I'd like to study this work with you. And the teacher would say, okay, good. Memorize the whole thing with meanings, come back, I'll quiz you. If you pass, we'll begin. I wasn't prepared to do that entire thing, but I thought I'll at least get some of my favorites by heart, and I did. I even learned how to write in this particular verse form, because I wanted to understand from the inside, as a writer, as a poet, what goes into creating these very short verses. But I never once thought about translating it. Part of this is my teacher's fault, because when I first began to speak Tamil, he said, you must never think in English, and you must never translate between the languages. And this is as far as learning to speak. So he said, I don't want you to be thinking in English, translating from English to Tamil, and then speaking your Tamilized English. He said, I want as soon as possible for you to be able to think in the language. Even if you're missing a word or two, use whatever you know to say what you want to say. And so I learned to do that. So I kind of had this kind of aversion to translating. So I never thought of doing it. In the years since that year of living in my teacher's house, he would tell me things. We would speak on the phone. I would go back to visit him from time to time, and he'd say, Tom, you know, somebody really ought to do a proper literary translation of the Kural. And this person should use all of those old commentaries that you and I read together. And I'd say, of course, that's a great project. I'm sure there must be some PhD candidate somewhere who will want to do this project. And it wasn't until 2015 when I suddenly thought, maybe I could try translating this book. At that point, I felt I had learned something about poetry. I felt I had at least some solidity to my practice as a poet. And so on the first day of 2016, I began translating a verse a day. Each of the book is arranged into 133 chapters. Each chapter has 10 verses. So I thought, if I do a verse a day, that's a chapter every 2 weeks. It'll take me forever, but oh well. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, I called my teacher and I said, hey, you know what you were talking about, somebody translating this book? Well, I thought I'll give it a try. And he said, oh, good. You finally got the hint. And what is so interesting to me about this is that my teacher never, in any other area of life, was shy about telling me what exactly I should do or not do, whether I wanted to hear it or not. But I think because he too was a poet, he understood you can't tell someone to take on a project like this. You can hint, you can suggest, and maybe it'll occur to them, or maybe not. And it did occur to me, and so I did work on the translation, and he insisted I go back to see him in South India, and so in the summer of 2017, I went back. It would be the last time I got to spend with my teacher, and we went through the entire manuscript. And we went through it as if I hadn't even studied it in 2003 and 2004. It was like learning the thing all over again. I thought I had a draft that was pretty good. And he said, no. Every single verse, he took me deeper into the original language, and every single verse, he pushed me further with the English, because his English was exceptional. And he would say, you got the gist of it, but this verse has no pizzazz. It has no oomph to it. It has no fizz. Try again. And so I did. We were able to do this in his old house. And in fact, because we were busy working, I didn't take many pictures, but I do have one picture. This is break time. He's taking a nap. He's in his 80s now. Oops. Let's go back. There we go. That's the same settee where we were seated with my parents almost 20 years before. He'd put some cushions on it, makes it a little more comfortable. And, we would work, he would get up, I would go out and get breakfast, we'd come back, we'd do a chapter, we'd take a little breather, we'd have some tea. Lunch was arranged through some neighbors, because at that point Amma, his wife, had passed away. But there was a neighboring household, and they would make lunch for us every day, and then we'd have a nap, and then we'd work on another chapter, and then we'd go for coffee. He had a favorite coffee shop down by the main highway, which was quite a walk, and sometimes he'd send me out with a flask and I'd bring it back, and sometimes one time we went together, and it was very sweet because he grabbed my hand almost like I was a little boy, or maybe he was a little boy, and we very slowly walked our way to his favorite coffee stand, enjoyed our very sweet, our very milky, a very strong South Indian coffee, and went back. And then this is the book, this is the translation that was published in January of this year by the wonderful Beacon Press. And so, in some ways I thought that was an end point, that I had carried out this translation, that I was happy, my teacher had given it his blessing, And then I realized there was one more piece, which is that if I say the Kural, almost everybody in English, there's very few people in English who have heard of this book. And this is interesting, because the Kural is a work on par with similar works of world literature such as the Tao Te Ching, or the poetry of Rumi, or the Bhagavad Gita, to name just a couple. And yet, for a number of different reasons, it hasn't entered into English in any substantial way. And I think part of the reason for that is that most translators, and many of them were very well-meaning British civil servants and missionaries, they were intent on translating the meaning of these poems. In other words, they would read the poem, they'd see what the poem meant, and they'd write that on in the translation. And what you would get would be sort of didactic lines about things you should do or not do. But all of the play of the language, the music, the rhythm, the fierce delight in life was gone. Almost all of the translations. And in fact, when I was working on the translation, I applied for an NEA fellowship to help fund the project. And I was startled to realize that there was not a single translation in print, a complete translation in print in North America. And this is 2016, 2017. And that was amazing to me. So now that the book is out, I feel entrusted with a task of sharing this book. Because in working on it, the way that I've been blessed to work on it, I've come to see how extraordinarily relevant and pertinent this particular work is. Because this is a work that's interested in practical wisdom, and how we bring wisdom into the nitty-gritty of everyday life. And so let me give you a taste. The book is divided into three main parts: ethics, power, and love. So I'm going to give you a taste of each of these sections. So in the section on ethics, for many of us in the present, in the Western Hemisphere in any case, ethics often conjures up an image of a set of rules that might help us decide what is right or wrong in any particular situation, what action might be right or wrong. But the vision of ethics we get from the Kural is a relational, contextual ethics. And contextual not just in the context of human relationships, but also more than human relationships. For example, the very first chapter of the Kural is on what either could be translated as God, or the gods, or the godlike qualities of great teachers, if you don't happen to like the metaphysical idea of a god. The chapter is open to all of those readings, and in fact has been adopted by communities, religious traditions, spiritual traditions of all kinds. The very second chapter is on rain. And here's a verse. Chapter 2, the glory of rain. This is the last of the 10 verses. I'll read it in the translation, and then I'll share the Tamil so you can hear something of the language, then I'll share the translation again. No being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain. Nirin jamaya dulaginin, yar kumbanin ramaya dork. No being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain. And so from the very beginning, this is a work that understands the earth beneath our feet and the heavens above, not just as metaphysical ideas, though they may be that too, but also as our practical, ecological possibility of being alive. And this verse is special to me also because it has a word in it that I learned way back at the beginning, before I had any idea I would be translating this book. It's a word that enters into the Kural again and again, and I've rendered as conduct. But this is conduct understood as being akin to water, to the way that water and land meet, join, and move. So it's something like the image of a river. And you can think of the way that the nature of water is to travel, is to move to the sea. And in moving to the sea, the water shapes the banks of the river, and the banks of the river shape the flow of the water. That is part of the vision of ethics involved in this book. And in fact, way back at the beginning, when I was first learning words, and my teacher taught me the root word of this word I've translated as conduct, he took me outside to his backyard. This is looking from the roof of the house. If you were looking over the wall, looking down, you would look down into the backyard. You see a coconut palm here. On the right, those are mango leaves. They had a beautiful mango tree. Here is a tulsi plant in a kind of ceremonial podium. But what I want to point out particularly is that there is a channel going along here and feeding and going in a ring around the coconut tree. And this is because the water from washing dishes, as well as rainwater that would fall on that patio roof with its parapet walls, would come out the spout, go down, and would be fed down to their own little garden. And this is, you can see it's not a huge backyard, but they were able to grow all sorts of lovely vegetables in it. Anyway, we were standing down on the ground, and he pointed, and he said, "Look up at that spout." And I could see the water trickling down the side of the spout. He said, that is the verb I'm telling you about, the movement of water. And at the time I thought, well, that's just kind of a trickle of water. How could that be as important as I could feel my teacher was telling me? And over the course of the 20 years that I've lived with that word, and that I've lived, for instance, with this work, I've come to see how profoundly that image flows through an understanding of ethics like this one. So, for instance, the very next verse in the third chapter, the first verse of the third chapter is on the greatness of letting go. And the first verse says, "Good books agree. The great let go in that way which is theirs." I'll say it again. Good books agree. The great let go in that way which is theirs. And this which is theirs is also this idea of conduct, being very specific. No two rivers are the same river. No two people are the same person. And just as any particular person will have their own way, and just as communities will have their own ways of being in the world, so too, there are many ways to let go, to find release, to find liberation. And so there is simultaneously a profound spiritual vision and a profound ecological underpinning to that vision. So that's a little taste of part one. Part two is on power, or prosperity, or the workings of community life. It is the longest of the three parts of the book, and it has extraordinary chapters on what it means to be a leader. What does it mean to be an advisor to a leader? When is the right time to do something? What is the right place in which to do something? What is the nature of friendship, and so on. But the verse I want to share with you is about farming. Because here in this great work of political philosophy, there's, again, this understanding of what really grounds us. And because I have some pictures, because I was living among farming people. I was living with gardening people here. And in the village, one of the main crops they had, this is a pile of peanuts. My village family, the family that adopted me, had a field, was not irrigated, but they could grow peanuts there. And I loved how the peanuts looked as they were drying. So I took a picture. And then I also loved this young nephew of mine, because everybody would be out helping with the peanuts. And then I just wanted to share one other picture. This is the cash crop of this particular village are jasmine flowers. So these are the flowers that would have been picked that morning from about 5:30 till 8:30, brought into the city. They're still in this very tight bud form. They'll be the flower vendors themselves will come and they'll buy. That's what this market is, the flower growers coming and sharing their flowers. The flower vendors come and take them. They make them into beautiful sort of ropes of flowers. At that point, the buds will start to open. and then they'll be used to decorate ladies' hair. It'll be offered to gods and so on. And then I also wanted to share a picture of a very special farmer. This is KPC Pichai, who was a dear friend of mine. He was what used to be called an untouchable. He preferred the term Harijan, which was Gandhi's term, children of God. The contemporary term would be Dalit. And he was a very interesting man because not only was he an organic farmer in a time when lots of other farmers around him and even in his own family were getting chemical fertilizers and using genetically modified seeds, he stuck to his belief in organic farming. But he also single-handedly ran a little Meals on Wheels. Every week on an appointed day, he and his wife would cook 20 packets or so of excuse me, lemon rice, tamarind rice, put them in banana leaves, tie them with some newspaper, and he would go, and he had a favorite bicycle rickshaw driver that he knew in the city of Madurai. He lived outside of the city, but he would come in, and he knew a place where there were a lot of people who didn't have anything to eat. And he would go and he'd do his rounds, and he would give food away as his way of his conduct, his form of conduct he had discovered for himself. He once said to me, I can tell just by looking at a person's face when was the last time they've eaten. So I wanted him as a very specific farmer because I wanted to read this verse in honor of him. This is from the chapter on farming. Farmers sustain everyone not farming. They are the pin holding the world together. Farmers sustain everyone not farming. They are the pin holding the world together. Imagine what would happen if every world leader had to read that before they could run for election. This was something that Gandhi understood. And this is why Gandhi in his 40s went and lived in the villages. And in fact, in something that I find very interesting, he fell in love with this book to the point that though he didn't speak Tamil, he decided he would learn it just so he could read the book. And his political life didn't allow him to go into it in the depths that he wanted to. But for his whole life, he revered the book, and he learned from it. He learned particularly from its own very deep vision of nonviolence. So that's a taste of part 2. That leaves part 3, love. Now, part 3 of the book, Love, is specifically on romantic love. Both the love of people who are secretly in love. They may not even know it themselves, or they don't want the other person yet to know it. And, as well, committed love, married love, the ins and outs of married life, including the last 3 books of the Kural are on the pleasures and subtleties and bliss of sulking. And you wonder why we've traversed this terrain and we end on sulking. And I think, this actually confused a lot of the British missionaries who were first translating. In fact, the earliest translations, they just left out the whole book on love. They're like, this isn't the real thing. The state and the king and that's the real thing. But there's something profound going on in these last verses. I think they actually anticipate some of the entire Bhakti movement which comes afterwards. What I've learned from these last 3 chapters is that when we're in a committed relationship, when we're in it for the long haul, of course we're going to misunderstand each other. Little misunderstandings arise and we turn away. We sulk. And every time we sulk, there's a chance to turn back again. And that turning back again has the possibility of being even sweeter than before. Because we're refining our understanding of each other. We're refining our understanding of ourselves, of what, in contemporary language, triggers us off. And it's all there. And I could go on and on about this particular set of 3 chapters. Because, so in a traditional, a very old, venerable tradition in India, there are actually 4 areas of life. There's ethics, there's power or wealth or prosperity, there's love, and then there's liberation, release from the cycle of birth and death. And commentators have often asked, why is it that there's only 3 of the 4 in this book? And the answer I give, I think, is a very good answer, which is, if you get the first 3 right, the 4th happens. It happens of its own. It happens like water flows to the sea. But I wanted to share one of the verses. Let me see if I can find it here. One of the things I love about this last part of the book is that some of the funniest, most lively, most life-affirming verses are there, the most playful verses. So here's just a little taste. This is in the voice, traditionally it would be read as the voice of the young woman. She's in love with the young man, but you can interpret it any way you wish. But it's in the voice of somebody who loves a man. And she says, or he says, the poet says, the figure in the poem says, "He dwells in my heart, so I fear hot food. I would not want him to get burned." Nenjattar kadalvaraga vedundal anjadum vepakarinde. He dwells in my heart, so I fear hot food. I would not want him to get burned. And there are verses like this which are fun and delightful and I think totally overturn certain expectations people may have coming to a book like this. One of the funniest and strangest things for me is there's an image of this work as an old kind of moralistic treatise, and it can certainly be read that way, and it certainly has been translated that way. But for me as a poet, and I think that there are many, many Tamil speakers who would share this experience, it's not that at all. It's gutsy, earthy, life-affirming exploration of what it means to be in relation with each other. And so I wanted to share one more verse, and then we'll have some conversation. Because although the 3rd book is the book on love, love in all of its varieties are threaded through the entire work. The king, for instance, or the queen, the sovereign, the leader, is meant to have compassion. And compassion is understood as eyes that can be moved. That kind of love. And in the first chapter, the first part on ethics, there is the love of family and of friends. And there is also the love that takes us from being a stranger, being received hospitably in a household, as I was in Meenakshi Sundaram's household, to becoming a friend, to becoming the member of a family. And that whole journey is traced out in this work. And so the verse I want to share connects with one last story I want to share at this point. My youngest brother in my family, the family that adopted me in the village, decided he didn't want to get married until his older brother, Tamanna, Anna is the word for older brother, Tamanna had to be there. So I thought, shoot, I got to get there. So I found a way to go back to Tamil Nadu to be there for the wedding. And I have one more picture. This is the wedding poster. There's my youngest brother and his bride, Amma, Appa, and the 4 remaining brothers, including a certain Pelachi Tom over here, just as an image for the kind of journey that I've experienced paralleled in the Kural. But this is actually not the story I wanted to tell you. The story I want to tell you is the very first day I got back to the village, I went to see my village Amma. And she was out by, at this point, my adopted family had bought a land with a well in it so they could grow their own jasmine. And she was staying out in the well because it was, not in the well, but there was a pump house that was sort of a house beside the well. And I came to see her, and as soon as I saw her, our eyes both filled with tears because we were so happy to see each other, and because of something more, which I didn't yet know at that time and came to know only later that day, which is that a couple months before I came back, she had been very ill. She'd been so ill. She'd been lying, and everyone thought that was it. They had stayed up with her all night, crying, singing to her. And somehow, and nobody knew how it happened, somehow she pulled through. And the family said, and the village said, oh, well, she's waiting for her other son to come back first. And so there's a Kural on that filling of the eyes that I want to share with you. It's from the chapter on having love. Is there a latch for love? The fullness of one's heart shows in the tears that well. Anbirkumundo arikumtar arbalar pun kanirpusal tarum. Is there a latch for love? The fullness of one's heart shows in the tears that well. And with this threading of love throughout the entire work, like the flowing of water throughout the entire work, we get to see how, as the great Zen monk Thich Nhat Hanh might have put it, ethics, power, and love inter-are with each other, and inter-are with all of us, and inter-are with the earth below and the sky above. So that's what I wanted to share by way of a kind of introduction to the work. And now I wanted to invite my neighbor and friend Wendy back on the stage for some conversation. Thank you.
I love hearing you speak. So I had a lot of questions that I wrote down while you were talking, Tom. You talked about the play of the language, and you used some words that your teacher, when he was talking to you about doing the translation, that he would say, it doesn't have fizz, it doesn't have pizzazz, it doesn't have pop. So do you have a favorite passage or two that kind of stand out for you as having that kind of zesty
Yes.
pizzazz?
And of course, the great paradox is that the passages, the better the poem is in Tamil, the harder it is to translate.
Yeah.
And so one of the first, if not the very first verse from the Kural that I ever learned, I learned because it had pop. It goes like this. You can hear it, I think. Tuparka tupaya tupaki, tuparka tupaya du marai. It's about rain. And you can hear, I think, this kind of pitter-pattering of rain. Tuparka tupaya tupaki, tuparka tupaya du marai. I tried to get something of that in there. And I got maybe a tenth of the way, a 15th of the way. The meaning of the verse is that rain is not just what allows food to grow, but is itself a nourishment, is itself food. So I translate it as making food fit for feeding, and itself food that feeds rain. So F sounds are not quite T sounds, so maybe it's more like a Pacific Northwest drizzle. But in a sense, that's a little glimpse into what I've tried to do. It's in translating a verse like this, clearly there is no exact equivalence. It's impossible. However, that's not where poetry happens. Poetry doesn't happen in the single words. Poetry happens in patterns of words. And so there'll be a pattern of words in the original, and together there'll be some kind of energy between them, some kind of rhythmic energy or musical energy. And so if I can create a similar pattern in English, which has a similar energy, maybe it's not exactly the same actual sound, but it mimics the rhythm or is somehow akin to it, then I feel like I've brought at least a suggestion of the music to the verse.
The other, one of the things that struck me when I was flipping through the book is that some of the verses, at least in my initial reading, were kind of like a koan, like that. And you, at some point, I think in your introduction or in your preface to the book, you talked about working with your teacher kind of over and over again. And so, just one passage that I read, those untroubled by trouble give trouble to trouble. And I had to kind of read it a bunch of times to try to tease that out. So will you read that in English and Tamil and then untease it a little bit?
Sure, I love that.
Do you want the page? 67.
There we go. This is from a chapter called Not Being Defeated by Adversity, which I think is a great chapter for now. My Dr. Ramakoti once said to me, drawing on an old trope, there are 3 kinds of poems. There are poems that are like grapes. You just toss them in your mouth, yum. Some poems are like bananas. You have to peel them first, then you get to enjoy them. Some poems are like coconuts. You got to crack the thing open to get to the flesh, to the sweet liquid. It's interesting. One of the things I've done with the translation is that I've also included a kind of commentary at the back of the book, because somebody reading this work in Tamil almost always will have an addition, which will have on one side will be the original verse. On the facing page will be what will be called a clarifying version, a version in translated into 21st century Tamil. And so they'll read the verse, and then some of them are instantly clear. Some of them you have to ponder, and so you might go back and forth. And for some of that back and forth, I put little notes in the back of the book. So here we have a poet, and I don't know if I mentioned the poet's name, Tiruvalluvar. Tiruvalluvar is the name of the poet. And he's interested in how do we face trouble without being ourselves troubled. And so he plays on that word. Those untroubled by trouble give trouble to trouble. It's kind of like a spiritual Aikido, right? In Aikido, your opponent comes after you with all this force of energy, and you just sort of turn it around and they knock themselves down. That's my understanding of how that works. So here we have, if you can be untroubled by trouble, any trouble that comes to you, it's going to be in big trouble. Edumbai padupar, edumbai kedumbai padadavar. And you can hear edumbai, trouble, 4 times. Edumbai padavar, edumbai padadavar. Those untroubled by trouble give trouble to trouble. And, you could just say, hey, dude, you don't want to get troubled, just don't be troubled. Trouble can't trouble you, and that's fine. But notice that to make that point the way he does makes it an unforgettable point.
Yeah.
It makes it a playful point. It makes something that you spend a little time with, and it stays with you. Something I realized I meant to say, I'm here with this book, and I'm reading the poems. But poems, in the printed poem on the page, is much more like a musical score than a document. In fact, that's why I wanted to read from a music stand. That sense that the poem gives us instructions on how to sing, to sing some verbal music. And here we get it really quite lovely with the idumbai in this playfulness, which is what saves the book from being stodgy or moralistic, and instead becomes infused with a kind of life-affirming energy. That's my experience. In fact, this whole chapter is like that. Here's another one. I mean, besetting those untroubled by its waves, affliction afflicts affliction. It's the same kind of playfulness there. And we're talking about like the big, horrors of life. And so, but we bring to those horrors, a kind of equanimity that can face them without being bowled over by them. And what a quality to cultivate.
And such a powerful message in such a succinct delivery.
Yes. And what is so, the way that this work lives in people's lives in South India is that people know these verses. The way people in, a Christian context will know a line from the Psalms or something like that. And you'll find yourself in a situation, and then a verse will come to your mind, and it will remind you. You may be troubled by some trouble, for instance, and then you might remember that verse. And in that moment of remembering, something happens. I mean, physiologically, something happens. You stop. You slow down. You might breathe a little more deeply and say, okay, what's really here? What can we really do? They're very practical that way, and it's what I love about it.
Yeah. And what can you tell us? You mentioned the poet who wrote the book. What can you tell us about him?
Well, Tiruvalluvar is understood to have been a weaver. And I love this, because this means he's not coming from a kind of priestly community. He's not a priest. He's not a kind of metaphysician or a leader of ritual. He's a person who works with his hands. He has a wife. He has kids. He has a livelihood. And in fact, we don't, if we wanted to look back at this poet in sort of a Western historical lens, there's actually not a lot we can say with great certainty. But it rings very true to me that the poet was a weaver, because that is actually what he's doing in this work too, which is that he's weaving together not just these words, but he's also weaving together all kinds of traditions that were already there, right there in Tamil Nadu. Traditions of ethics, traditions of love poetry, traditions of sort of political philosophy. So each verse weaves words together, each chapter weaves verses together, each section weaves chapters together, just as he would have woven cloth together. And in fact, there's one more interesting connection here, which is one of the words for book in Tamil, nul, is also the word for thread. And I remember talking with Dr. Ramakodi about this, and he said, why is that? And he said, well, think about it. To make a book, you take fibers, the very substance of the earth, and you spin it into a single line of text, a single thread. We speak about this in English too, right? We weave we spin a tale, we tell a yarn. It's the same set of root metaphors. And so just as a book can be a spun thread, a poet or a weaver can weave a texture, textile. It's the same beautiful metaphors there.
Love that. All right, I have one more question, and then I want to see if you all have questions. So you've been immersed in studying this book for how many years?
Good. 5 years translating it, but maybe 20 years I've lived with it.
Yeah. So how has that study and the process of translation shifted your thinking or impacted your life? Like, how have these teachings kind of informed you?
That's a great question. At the level of poetry, it's sort of reworked my mind. It's reworked my heart and mind. Because I come to translation as if it is a kind of apprenticeship. I get to sit at the feet of a master, like the 12th century Tamil woman Avvaiyar, maybe the 5th, 3rd, 4th century weaver Tiruvalluvar. And the more deeply I understand the poem, the more deeply I get to understand the poet's heart and mind, and learn through that mirror something about my own heart and mind. But there is also, beyond the the poetry, the learning about the properties of words, the property of language, there is also a kind of way that a book like this works on a person, like the ideas of it. And so here's a book, 133 chapters on all of these different aspects of life, some of which are contradictory, meaning that one chapter will apply to an ascetic, somebody who has renounced the householder's life. Well, that chapter is not going to apply to the householder, the person who's decided to be at home in the world. They'll have their own sort of thing. But if you sitting with this whole range of experience, it is really deep in my sense of what does it mean to have integrity, in the sense of what does it mean to integrate all of the parts of our lives. And I think a work like this has challenged me and has continued to challenge me to how to bring all of those pieces together. Not just the ethical piece, not just what does it mean to be a good leader or a good listener or a good student. What does it mean to be a good lover? What does it mean to be a good parent? What does it mean to be a good child? All of these things. And it's a reminder of the whole of it through each of these teeny little verses. And that's what delights me. And in fact, as I've been, preparing to give interviews and to talk about the book, I'm almost reading it again for the first time, because I've sort of gone through studying it in Tamil, and then I've brought it into English, and now I'm sort of looking at them both and saying, oh, wow, there's still things to learn here. That's what I'm learning.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, do any of you have any questions for Tom?
Is this the part where you worked in a magic trick?
Is there any magic?
It's all in here.
The words of the magic.
Hey, Thomas.
Yes. Hi, Tom.
How many translations have there been, English translations are there of this book?
How many English translations of this book are there? That's a great question. There are, at the time I applied for the NEA grant, the number I came up with was 80. Wow. More recently, I saw a number saying there's maybe 100 translations. Wow. It is the most translated book from the language. And that's an interesting statistic. And it is equally interesting to me that although it's the most translated book in the language, it's a book that, like I was saying earlier, hasn't really entered into the sort of English reading public in the way like the Tao Te Ching or even I Ching, even more obscure books have. And I think that's really just because the book hasn't actually appeared. By which I mean the poetry of these poems hasn't really appeared yet in English, because a lot of these translations are a little more wooden. They're a little, or they're simply outdated. And so, along with that number, and of course there are translations. In fact, I was just invited to send a video greeting to the Singapore National Library, because they've just opened a 20,000 volume collection of Tamil literature, mostly in Tamil, some in translation into English and into Chinese, about Tamil culture. And so I sent a little video clip, and there's in this new, very beautiful exhibit, at least from what I've seen online, there's a whole display of translations of the Kural into Thai, into Polish, into all these different world languages. And there's also what has happened, which is a lot of the translations that are made into other languages go by way of English. And so there's this, and if, depending on how close or far the English translation is, the one into the further language may be that much further or maybe that much closer, depending.
You mentioned that you know some Spanish. Have you read it translated into Spanish?
I haven't. I should check that out.
Yeah, curious. Yeah.
I was once asked to give a talk in Oaxaca, Mexico, about Tamil literature, and I translated from Tamil into Spanish, and it was forging new connections in
Neural
my brain.
pathways in your
it was very disorienting and really rewarding.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Did you come across any translated version that you can
These are beautiful questions. So the first question, were there any translations that I connected with? And the answer is no. I mean, and I don't mean that as a kind of point of pride so much as, in fact, my first, 1998, my first year in Madurai, I'd come across a translation in a room, and I'd opened it up, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. That particular translation had been in print from Penguin Classics, and it was a decent translation. I talk about it a little bit in the preface here. But the truth is, for me as a poet and as a reader, none of the translations captured what I experienced reading the book. And so, when I was doing this, I didn't read any of the other translations. I was really reading as deeply into the original as I possibly could and seeing what it might teach me to hear and to try and render. And of course, the paradox of the translator is, if you want to read this book all the way, you're going to have to go to Tamil. I mean, because some of the verses are so deeply embedded in the language. But I hope that I've brought at least something forward that shares one step closer to that delightful, playful use of language. Now, your second question about a sense of responsibility. Well, that's a wonderful question, and I feel a huge sense of responsibility because this is a book which is revered. It's revered not only as a great work of wisdom literature, it's revered as a holy text for some people. It's considered like the Tamil Bible or the Tamil Veda for some people. You can even find editions that sort of look like a Bible edition. They have a little red letter for the for the verses and black letter for the commentary and so on. And so I would never have done it, I think, had my Tamil teacher not suggested it to me. And I would never have done it if he hadn't said, okay, you come back and we'll look at it together so that I could know that I had at least gotten it mostly right. And at the same time, the sense of responsibility is not just to have done a good job with it, but also to now that it's in English, this particular version is in English, to do what I can to kind of help let people find ways to let people know about it. I mean, I'm a poet. I'm not a marketing person. I'm very, very hesitant and shy about those kinds of things. And yet I believe in this book, and I believe that it is extraordinarily pertinent and relevant to now, to the kind of global mess we can find ourselves in, how to think about it in a way that's fresh, even though it's 15 centuries old. And so, for instance, I'll even put this out to the audience and people watching that if you know of places or organizations or groups that might be interested in hearing about this work, I've sort of dedicated this year following the publication to giving interviews and talking about it, and I would be very happy to be in touch with such groups. Because I really I would love, if I could say what I would hope for, I would love for the book to have a life in English, the way the Tao Te Ching or the poetry of Rumi now has taken on a life in English. And it would join into the conversation that we have in English about how do we live? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to organize our communities in such a way that they are harmonious and peaceful, and they honor the farmers and the soil beneath our feet as much as they honor the leaders? Or the sort of figureheads of any particular culture. So it's a very simultaneously humbling and nourishing responsibility. Hi, Jill.
Such an amazing, beautiful picture. I believe in your book. Also, I haven't even touched it yet. I wonder, was really especially loving, speaking of water, and I wonder if you would say more about the land.
So the region that we call Tamil Nadu is in the south eastern part of the country, and it's in a kind of rain shadow. So the state of Kerala gets a lot of rain, and so it's very lush, very green, And as the clouds sort of go and nourish the slopes, and then they come over to the Tamil Nadu side of the Western Ghats, and it's a much drier climate. And it's a place that it's very seasonal. The monsoons will bring, there's several different sort of seasonal monsoons that will bring in the rain. And so agriculture, for instance, has had to adapt to the time of the rains and the time of the harvest, and also the time of the heat, the time when we wait for the rain to come back again. And traditionally, there's been an extraordinary system of what are called sort of village tanks or irrigation systems, which would catch the rainwater. And it would catch the rainwater where it fell, and then the water would seep into the ground and replenish the aquifers and so on. And this still, to a more limited extent, goes on, and is also, as cities become bigger, one of the first things to go are these village tanks, because that's now become valuable real estate. And then, of course, there are also people who are working to preserve that system. So it is also a very hot, it can be a very, very warm place. And one of the things I often talk about is that as far as differences between language, if I say something to you that makes you feel good, you might say, well, that warms my heart. That's heartwarming. We have this image of warmth. We even talk about the warmth of our relations with each other, being warm, having a pleasant quality, a beautiful, cordial quality. Whereas in Tamil, one of the things I learned very early on, if you want to say something, you're happy about something, you might say, well, I'm feeling cool. There's even an idiom, at least 20 years ago, there's an idiom that if you put ice on somebody's head, you're buttering them up because you want some favor. So because the ice is so cold, but this is not unpleasant. This is refreshing, right? So I'm going to put some ice on your head, and you're going to ask me, oh, what do you want? Right? The way that idioms shape, and the way that landscape shapes our idioms. And in fact, one more thing is that the wonderful, rich, classical Tamil love poetry, this is now going 2,000 years ago, was a poetry of landscapes. And there were sort of 5 archetypal landscapes, each landscape drawing on the actual landscape, but being infused with certain qualities. So, for instance, the hillside was the meeting place, the secret meeting place of lovers. The desert was the absence of love, the absence of water, and so on. And then, the seashore is a certain kind of, and so the fauna, the flora, the physical features would take on, would give us an image for the landscape of the human heart. So this is a language which has been deeply intertwined with its landscape for millennia, and is another of the things that I think makes it such a rich and refined language and refined sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to kind of ask you to maybe go a little deeper on that, because my limited understanding is that very few other cultures outside of the modern West actually have a language that distinguishes nature and culture the way we draw that hard line. And like I guess from talking to people in Japan, there isn't a word for nature in Japan. I mean, it just is. Right, like we're modern Western people are unique, as I understand it, are unique in human history in thinking about humans and nature as being 2 separate entities, perhaps in conversation or not, but that division. So like David Abram talking about the greater than human world, trying to resituate how we think of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And you have alluded to talking about nature, and you're talking about what we would call nature, the greater than human world in what you were just describing. And I'm just asking if you could maybe elaborate on that idea a little bit more, or how in your own journey with this text, have you found that being part of that mental shift that you described?
That's a wonderful question. And in fact, I had gone into the study of Tamil with questions of that kind, about how do we think about what we would call nature? How do we think about what we would call culture? How do we, and one of the things that happens when we look to languages, to literary traditions, to oral traditions beyond our own, is that we realize that the categories that we may take for granted are just categories. They're not necessarily the true names for the way the world is. They are one set of names, and they may be useful in certain circumstances, and they may not be as useful in others. So when I was studying Tamil, when I was living in this particular village, when I was working on this translation, I was paying a particular attention to how the poet, how the work is thinking of our relationship to what we would in English call nature. And I would not necessarily say that there's a full-fledged ecological vision here. There's an extraordinarily deep ecological sensibility there. I think we now in the present are given the task of fleshing that out in a way that previous cultures around the world have not necessarily had to articulate, because everybody understood, right? That we are already part of the world. We are already ourselves natural beings in a natural world, and that our conduct should flow from that understanding, that we read what is, even in Western tradition, sometimes been called the book of nature, that nature can speak to us, that what we call nature can speak to us. And what does it mean to sort of go beyond those categories? And so one of the things I find so nourishing about reading traditions such as this one is that they shake up our assumptions. They take us beyond what we've been assuming without assuming that we're assuming it.
Wait, is that a passage?
No, I.
It sounds like it doesn't.
But that idea, because there's a kind of substratum of assumptions that we make that we don't really get to see until we step back far enough to realize, oh, there's an assumption there. And this is why I feel so passionately about not just translation, but intercultural dialogue, because it's in conversation with cultures, especially cultures that have been rooted in a land for thousands of years and whose language grows out of that rootedness. We can teach each other things about how we describe the world and what it is that we're describing and who are we that describe it.
And if I may,
Yes.
on a different tack, you also alluded several times to rhythm and musicality in the language. And my husband has been studying tabla many years. And when you read that passage about the rain, it sounded so much like he also has had to memorize whole musical
Yes.
passages. And it sounded so much like that to me. I was really struck by it. So, sorry, I just wondered if you could speak to that, and I just heard that music so profoundly. So I was wondering, do these verses get performed musically? Is there a kind of overlap between those that happen?
That's a great question. The question was, do these verses get performed musically or rhythmically? And they do. And in fact, that's one of my ongoing questions right now, is that as a musician myself, I've been wanting to explore more about that. And I have found recordings of people who will sing a verse, whether they'll sing it in a sort of South Indian classical style or a South Indian film music style. There are versions, and they can be chanted, and they lend themselves to chanting and to singing. And in fact, there was an event in Seattle in December where there was a musician who took 3 of the verses and created an interlocking song. Each verse got its own line, and they all fit together. And I was so deeply gratified to see that the English could also lend itself to being woven together into song. And so that's very much, for me, an open question that I'm excited to explore, and I'd be excited to learn more and tell you more, hopefully sometime soon.
Excited to see how that turns out.
Yes.
A
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, this talk, because it's being live streamed, will also be on the VCA website. VCA TV, I think, is the
Yep.
on the VCA website, and I'll also on my own website, thomaspruiksma.com. If you go to the page on the Kural, there are 2 links there because I've been sharing each week. I've been sharing a verse from the work in English and Tamil in English. And there's also a series of conversations I've been having with healers, with artists. I had a wonderful conversation with the painter Pam Ingalls a couple weeks ago, with spiritual leaders. And we take 2 verses, 3 verses, and we explore, how do they speak to that person's artistic practice or religious or spiritual tradition. And I've found those really, really nourishing, and I've learned a heck of a lot doing those. So those are also things you can check out and share.
I want to check it out. I'm glad you asked your question.
Yes, Tom.
I read there were 10 commentaries on the work, of which 5 are lost and 5 are known. Can you speak, what is a commentary on the work and why, or just how 5 are lost and 5 exist, and why there's only 10? If I read it correctly.
No, that's great. The question is about commentaries to the work. And there are, in fact, numerous commentaries. What you were probably reading was about the oldest commentaries, of which some have survived and some haven't. And the way that these books were passed down was that they were etched into palm leaves with like a stylus. And so you'd have these palm leaf manuscripts. And so they would have to be protected, and they would have to be recopied from time to time. Sometimes they got eaten by insects. And so the ones that we don't have, we know about because they're referred to by other writers. And the ones that we do have, there's a number of very, very highly regarded commentaries. And I draw, in fact, for the commentary that I put together for this book, I draw on the oldest, which is my personal favorite, as well as the more or less recent 13th, 14th century commentary, which is sort of considered the greatest, or one of the most esteemed commentaries, because it's very comprehensive and very beautifully done. But to this day, a Tamil scholar, to sort of become a Tamil scholar, might write a commentary to the Tirukkural. There are politicians who have written their own sort of, contemporary Tamil version that will be printed side by side with the original version. And so there's really a kind of culture around the work. It makes me think of the way that, for instance, the plays of Shakespeare, every time they're performed, that performance is kind of like a commentary, right? Reinterpreting it, setting it in, 22nd century London, or whatever it is, right? They're spaceships with Hamlet, but every time that the work is in that genre of a play, is every time it's mounted, it's a new vision of the work. Well, this work has every time a new scholar or public figure or writer makes a commentary, they offer their vision of the work. And in fact, there's a whole kind of genre of debating in which people will debate, and they may discuss verses from the work. And so it's part of the cultural ethos, if you will, part of the ongoing dialogue that people have with each other, with their history, with the world.
Finally, I have a book that you signed for me. Thank you. And can you speak to the cover? Who designed it? It's beautiful.
Thank you for pointing out the cover. I think the name is Louis Rowe. And I love that you mentioned the cover. And there it is. And I'll tell you why. Because there is a long tradition of printing the book, not only in Tamil, but also in other languages, with an image of the poet Tiruvalluvar. And I honor greatly the poet Tiruvalluvar. And if you're in South India, you see the image of the poet, and you know exactly who he is and what he stands for. It also has the effect for somebody who doesn't understand what the image is, that I go, who's this guy seated on a cross-legged, and what is his connection to me? And what I really wanted to convey And I told the editor at Beacon this. I said, you know, I don't want to have any kind of representational art. I don't want it to be a place. I don't want it to be a person that somebody may or may not. I mean, and ideally, my ideal audience for this book are people who've never heard of Tiruvalluvar, they've never heard of the Kural, they've never heard of Tamil, but they may hear something in this that will speak to them. So I said, let's have words and let's have some design. And I crossed my fingers, and then they sent me this, and I was delighted. And I think you mentioned earlier in one of your earlier questions, Tom, about wanting to do justice, and I felt an aspiration to do justice not only to the translation, but to the whole book. So the cover, including even the layout of the book, each chapter has its own page, which is how it would be published in Tamil Nadu. But it's more expensive that way, because if you ran the chapters together, you could save some pages. And I'm all for saving paper, mind you. And I said, no, for this book, we need a chapter a page, because that is part of the experience of reading, and that's part of doing justice to the work. So thank you for drawing your attention to the cover. Yes?
Is the word that, I'm sorry, I'm going to mangle it, Tirukkural, is that translatable? I mean, does it have a meaning?
That's a great question. Kural is the word for the verse form in which the book is written. The full name is Kural Venba, this 1 5/8 line form. It is interesting. Before Tami woke up feeling not so good this morning, she and I had a conversation, and there is a form in Tamil. In fact, when I did the Avvaiyar translation, there's a 4-line form. The first 3 lines are full lines. The last line is 5/8 of a line. And that is a venba. That's this larger form. And then you take the last 2 lines of that, and you get the Kural venba, which is the most compact we can get. And it is similar, if you want to look at sort of similar traditions, to what we have in Japanese literature, where you have the 5-line waka form, and then haiku is the last 3 lines of that 5-line form. So here we also have a distillation. Tiru, in the full Tirukkural, Tiru is an honorific term, which means sacred, holy, honored, esteemed. And so Tirukkural would be the esteemed, the holy, the sacred, Kural, this verse form. A beautiful question. Do we have time for maybe one last question before we wrap up? Yes. What drew me to that part of the world? I can only give you part of an answer, because part of it is a mystery to me. Because when I graduated from college, I had not intended to go to South India. I'd intended to go to Mexico and learn Spanish and explore village life in an indigenous community in the state of Oaxaca. But I'd had a long fascination with India that I don't know where it came from. Every time I did a research project for geography class in school, I chose India. Maybe it had something to do with my fascination as a young magician with magic books, which would have, imagery of Indian magicians, Chinese magicians, as well as European conjurers. But for whatever reason, I had had a long fascination with the country. And then when I was in the running for a fellowship to go to Mexico. That totally fell through. This other thing kind of landed in my lap, and I thought, that's not what I was planning to do. And then I wrestled with it, and I thought, maybe I'll go there. And it turned out to be one of the biggest turning points of my life. My teacher has a different version of this story, which is that maybe 2 or 3 months after maybe just the first month actually, when we started studying with him, and I was studying along with a colleague of mine, the two of us would come to his house and study. We would have dinner, because we often ate before or after we studied. Sometimes we didn't even study, we just ate because it was a festival day or something. And he looked at us across the plates of beautiful rice and sauces of different kinds, and he said, a year ago, did you imagine, a year from now, you would be coming to the township of Tirunnagar here in Madurai in Tamil Nadu and studying the Tamil language with me? And we said, no, we had no idea. And he sort of smiled and said, this is what we in our tradition call fate. And then he proceeded with his dinner. And there was, regardless of what a person believes or does not believe about what could be called fate or destiny or any of the things, there was something fated about it. Even if just in the sense that I needed, for whatever reason, to have this person as my teacher, to learn from him not just how to speak, but something about poetry, about the nature of poetry and the nature of the world through poetry. And he was looking for a student. And so we were given a great gift of being in that relationship. And so this work is as much a testament to that friendship as to anything else. So thank you.
Really quite astounding and very special to be here in this moment.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
How enriching this is for the world that you've done.
Oh, thank you. I saw a hand waving excitedly in the back.
Did you ever have a dream before you started all of this or during it that was profound to you about it?
A dream, like a premonitory?
No, a dream.
A dream?
Not a vision, but a dream, like a real.
Like an actual dream at sleep? I don't recall having a dream about.
Beforehand or a vision then?
All I can say is that I had a yearning, an aspiration, a desire to see what would happen if I stepped out of English and stepped into a rooted language, a rooted community, and see what happens. And so if a yearning or a desire is a kind of vision, then yes, I did.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here tonight, here or live streaming. There are copies of the book in the lobby if you are interested in looking at one, or I'm happy to sign a copy, or if you picked one up, they're available at the Vashon Bookshop. If you're watching on the live stream beyond the shores of Vashon, they're available just about everywhere. There are links on my website to where they're available around the world if you are interested in taking a peek.
All right, so we'll all move into the atrium and
Perfect.
you can sign some books.
Lovely. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.